Islam Media, and you are tuned into the Ashraf God.
Let me tell you about Sentio Capital. Now, Sentio's Invest for Good philosophy is based on a genuine desire to use their investments, on the investment skills in this case, for the benefits of broader society, while also delivering superior returns for clients regardless of market conditions. If you want to know more, as you should, then visit their website, which is sentiocapital.com. Sentiocapital.com for more information on their Sharia investment products, right? Sentio Capital, invest for good. Sentio Capital Management is an authorized financial services provider. Okay, let's talk about the Electoral Amendment Bill being signed into law, and what does that really mean? My guest is Lulu White. She's the CEO of EMCA, which is the Elections Management Consulting Agency of Africa. Lulu, appreciate your time. Good morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Ashraf.
Thank you. Okay, so Ramaphosa signing this Electoral Amendment Bill into law, I mean, is at a high level. What's it about? Should it interest me?
Absolutely. It's a very important piece of legislation, though it has its own shortcomings, but it is an important piece of legislation because this new law is basically saying people that are independent candidates can actually now actually allowed to participate in the elections as candidates for parliament and for provincial legislatures. That's just basically the high level basic response to it, that if you're an independent candidate, or if there's a community in a community, one person and you believe in this person and you think that make a great difference to your community in parliament, then that person can be nominated independently without being a member of any political party.
Okay, so are we saying in the past that could not happen? That means there's an election in 2024. If I decide, well, you know what, I want to serve my country, but I'm really, none of the parties impress me enough to be aligned to them. And if I stood as an independent in the past, I could get voted at people could vote for me at what, regional level, but never into parliament. Is that correct?
In the past, you couldn't get an independent candidate both at provincial legislature and even at National Assembly. You could only do that only in the ward.
At local council,
at local government elections. That's the only place where you could find that. But this piece of legislation now changes that. If you want to know, they're called regions for the purposes of this. If you want to contest in a particular region, then you select which regions you want to participate in. You have to be nominated, and there has to be a quota, a number of people within that particular region that actually support you, like present signatures for your nominations, and then you're then able to be nominated for that process.
Okay.
But then there's also something very significant that came up with the legislation. I think in the past we have had discussions about these smaller political parties that would then mushroom their way into National Assembly. This legislation also now places those political parties to now have a support base. So if the Elephants Party is interested in contesting in Gauteng, whereas in the past all they had to do was pay a deposit, now they also have to make sure that they've got a specific quota. I think it's about 8,000 people that are supporting its nomination to be able to contest the particular region as well. So it's a twofold. It's to basically allow for greater opportunity, greater participation, particularly for independent candidates, but also it kind of forces political parties, particularly those that are regarded as smaller political parties, to now be able to actually fight for their support before the actual day of the election.
So that means before, not during election. In fact, well before their election, they must prove their bona fides by getting these 8,000 people to sort of sign a petition to say we support you.
That's
right?
what it means.
Okay, that all sounds very good. So is this conversation that we're talking about, is this a case of something to celebrate, or are there warning signs of concern here?
Look, it is something that we should be celebrating. Obviously, as people in the election space, we have a few issues that we've got. For example, one of the biggest ones that we have is that in terms of the quotas of support, we do feel that many of us in the election space actually do feel that it's a limitation for independent candidates. If I'm in Gauteng and somebody nominates me from Gauteng, I would need 8,000 signatures before I actually qualified to be on the ballot. So that in itself is a limitation. Of course, then you've got a bigger fight that you have to look for once you're on the ballot, because then you also have to raise funds for being able to campaign throughout the country to get the number of votes that will then give you a seat in parliament. That's the first one. So the second one also is the fact that independent candidates are only allowed to contest 200 of the 400 seats that you have in parliament, while for political parties they can contest any one of them. But for independent candidates, they're only contesting the parliamentary seats, 200 parliamentary seats out of the 400. That is a concern, because yes, it appears to be giving fairness to a process, but at the same time it's unequal. It's unequal opportunities that are being given to political parties and to independent candidates.
Okay, so why has that been the case? Why peg it at 200 and not 400? Why is that? And maybe as you answer that, who was charged with drafting this bill?
The bill was obviously drafted by Parliament and it was approved by Parliament, and that is the question that all of us have asked, to say, but why are you providing an unequal field for independent candidates, and nobody has been able to answer that. Instead, what Parliament and what the IEC has already done is to set up an electoral reform panel that would then look into all of those issues. And when it was questioned, we're then told that this is a transitional it's a transitional legislation to allow for the space for. Now, if one says something is transitional, then we are under the impression that this is a work in progress, and we are hoping that in future we're going to see a period where independent candidates can be allowed to contest all 400 of those seats.
Yeah,
But
it sounds rather bizarre.
quite-
I mean, it does sound bizarre, because if it's transitional, then need I say it, then it almost makes sense that it should not have been included in 2024.
Why?
Not that I'm in agreement
Absolutely.
with that, but then say, hold it, let's perfect this. It could well be 5 years later. The fact
Yeah.
that it's transitional suggests something else will happen, but already they're being prejudiced, right? Now, I mean, that's the one thing. The other part that you mentioned, in terms of those quotas, you talk about 8,000. I understand that the quotas are 8,000 or so to prove your bona fides. That's really what it is for parties. But I understand it's almost double, virtually, for independents, and not the 8,000 you spoke about.
Look, it's the 8,000 was just an example that I picked up for Gauteng as a province. For example, in the Northern Cape, I think you only need about 1.4 people, 1,400 people to support you. So depending on the region that you're contesting in, then the number fluctuates, goes out and goes down, up
Okay.
and down, as per the number of where you are.
Principally, and here's the principle, I think the numbers are less important now. Principally, an independent would require X numbers of people to sign a document to prove his or her bona fides. A political
Yes.
party requires the same X numbers of people. But is it true to say that the independence X numbers of people versus the political party X numbers of people in the same region, the requirement is double for the independents and therefore half for the political parties? Is that accurate? If I got that wrong?
Absolutely, because absolutely, one would think like that, because if you think about it, political parties already have a support base. That's why they're registered as political parties, right? So, maybe they don't have seats in parliament yet, or they don't have seats in any place in government. But the fact that they are a political party means that in terms of formation, in terms of organization, they're way much more ahead than an independent candidate would be. That then also places the independent candidate at a disadvantage. There's also the issue of also raising funds. When you're a political party, a much more formalized structure, one gets the impression that it's much easier to be able to raise funds, whether it is for contesting, whether it is for running for that particular office. It becomes easier. That cannot be said for an independent candidate. So there are a lot of limitations that are coming, particularly for independents. It's like you're being told that the field is being leveled, but when you look at where you are standing, you realize actually you've got a much more tough call than the other political
Yeah, it's
parties.
a good point. I mean, the other part that you made about the parliament, where you say 200 seats versus 200 out of 400. I mean, I think it's obviously blatantly unfair, but that's the one part. But the other part I understand coming out of that, and I think this is particularly important, that because only 200 seats are reserved for independents, if they even get that much, they may never get that much. We know that, right? That a person who votes, and if the independent gets the required amount of votes to get into parliament, but let's say the required amount is 20,000, for example, for that year, or 50,000. But if 100,000 people decided to vote for that independent, because they don't contest under proportional representation as a party, there's a question about where do those votes go to. And I understand I've been told it's been divided amongst all the other political parties. Is that correct?
No, actually, what happens is that those votes are actually wasted. You remember the purpose of proportional representation when South Africa went in and created the electoral system was to ensure that every vote is basically recorded. Now, once as an independent, a person contests and they get more seats, more than seats, well, technically more than one seat based on the number of the calculations, it means that 80,000 of those votes are actually wasted votes. They cannot be recalculated and given to anybody else, but those votes are actually wasted votes.
Okay, so either way, whether they are divided amongst the rest of the parties equally, or whether they are just thrown in the dustbin, either way, the impact is the same, which means my vote to the independent is not equal to my vote for a political party. They've been prejudiced.
That is where there's a travesty of justice right there.
So I notice already whereas everybody's in support of independence standing, I certainly am. There are a few notable, groupings already contesting this. In fact, saying that this entire issue is already unconstitutional. They will challenge this. What do you think is going to happen there?
Look, it would be interesting to see what's going to happen, particularly because I had hoped that all of these issues would be rectified before it was actually signed into law. Okay. Now, the fact that it has been signed into law, it just makes the battle much longer now. But definitely, this is unconstitutional and it's an unfair application of the law. It would be interesting to see whether Parliament is going to set this aside and then we can have 2024 as an election, or whether the courts, whether the courts will set this aside and we can have this 2024 election without the legislation, or the legislation is being cleaned up, or whether we are going to proceed with the way that it is under the guise that it is going to be, it's a transitional law. Now, At the same time, is this a win for independent candidates? Maybe we can call it a win. It's not a perfect win, but at least it is a win, because we come from a history where we did not have that at all. You were forced for Parliament to vote for political parties and not for independents.
Yeah, it's rather strange. Just to confirm the question I asked you earlier on, yes, it has to be signed into law by the president, which was done. Parliament effectively were asked to deliver. But as part of the ruling, did Parliament consult? Were they required to consult on the outside, or was it strictly Parliament? I mean, I'm thinking of the obvious organization like the IEC, for example. Were they not consulted? Were they not required to be consulted on this issue?
Look, the IEC. One of the other arguments against the law actually was the fact that there was not enough public participation on the law. I think that is another thing that is likely to have it set aside, because a lot of the democracy and civic societies that are complaining are saying there was not adequate enough consultation. It was particularly also during COVID, so there was not enough participation from the public in terms of interacting with the legislation to make sure that it actually covers everybody on board. With regards to the IEC, I think it's very important that we understand that the IEC is the administrator. So the Parliament passes the law, and the role of the IEC is simply to put into practice and make it applicable to everybody so that it works. I doubt that the IEC would be contesting this if it had to be taken to court. I don't think the IEC would also be standing in court and contesting and fighting against this bill, because their role particularly is just to administer the law as it is given to them by Parliament.
Well, I certainly can see many other lobby groups doing just that. I mean, your point about leveling the playing fields just gets me back to thinking about apartheid South Africa. For example, on the 27th of April, 1994, when the anniversary comes up, 30th anniversary comes up, or 29th comes up soon, right? Simply being given the chance to vote did not level the playing fields. If someone lived in a shack and the other person lived in a mansion, the question is, if we want to have redress, what are the efforts being made to give, in this case, the independents a chance to actually flourish? The obvious question, you don't have to answer it, is it's clear that the political parties, it's not in their interest for these independents to flourish, because they will take away votes from them. Therein lies the conundrum. Lulu White, appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fascinating indeed. I can see this being challenged constitutionally, being dragged through, and the problem is that election time is ticking. It could be, I don't know, April, May next year. It could be later. But either way, this is a huge problem. Giving the independents a chance to be independently elected to the highest office of the land, but in reality, effectively, handicapping them at the same time to prevent them from doing just that. Something's rather wrong there. Let's talk finance. Let's talk Islamic finance with the team from 27/4 in a moment.